Are you thinking about selling your business one day? Do you know what the common pitfalls that business sellers, business owners that are looking to sell fall into? No? Then watch this video. You'll find out a whole plethora of pitfalls that people have fallen into. And the intention is that you learn from other people's mistakes. Enjoy. Hi, and welcome back. My name is Rob Goddard. I'm a multiple business owner. I'm delighted to be in the presence of two lawyers, not just one, two lawyers. Hello, Guvvy. Hello, Maung.
Good morning.
Hi, Rob.
Brilliant. And we were just speaking off air that our association between us actually goes back 20 years because Guvvy and I first knew each other 20 years ago doing transactions. Me selling businesses, you doing the legals, Guvvy, and then Maung probably in the last decade you've joined the party. So I think between us, we've done several dozen successful transactions. So this series is called Legal Eagles because you're the go-to guys, as far as I'm concerned, for anything legal related to do with selling businesses. And so I think this session really is about the audience. It's about your time. And to be able to get two experts in this field will not only give you food for thought and knowledge, but it may also ensure that you avoid the pitfalls, because there are many, aren't there, chaps, of selling a business from a legal position.
Yeah, there are indeed, Rob. And I think it's always good to speak to people about, things that make transactions run smoother, potential pitfalls to avoid, because it is a stressful process. It's a stressful process, but it's a worthwhile one, I think.
So, I mean, that's a useful cue in really to, I've got a number of questions here that I'm regularly asked by business owners that are thinking about selling. So the first one actually relates very neatly into what you've just said, Maung. Question I often get asked is, why do I need a lawyer, Rob, involved in what will be a very straightforward transaction, selling my business?
Well, I think the simple answer is, as a business owner, you're going to be busy running your business, and you've got a particular skill set. And we, on the other hand, have a different skill set. And although commercially, the commercials of a transaction can be agreed, from a legal perspective, there is a process to go through. There are certain documents that need to be drafted. And of course, the documents do contain certain risks, certain nuances that as a business owner, you may not be familiar with. So, people like Guvvy and myself, we will hold your hand and guide you through that process to make sure as a seller, you're as protected as you can be. And the object is to protect the cash that you're going to be getting for the business that you've built up over, a long period. And so our simple objective is to get you the cash as quickly as possible and to protect it.
Guvvy, have you come across situations where someone either hasn't taken legal representation to sell their business and got into a pickle, or has appointed a lawyer and still got into a pickle because they picked the wrong lawyer? No names. I don't want your law firm to get sued.
Rob, thanks. I'm just going to look.
Have you come across?
Yes. So just going back to what Maung said, most clients aren't repeat offenders when it comes to selling a business.
Yeah.
You're only going to do it once, and it's the legals, but it's also the philosophical bit. It is the bit where you, as seller, will say, is this normal? Because you don't do it as a seller every single day. Maung and I see it every single day. So most sellers don't have a benchmark. Is this normal? And without a lawyer, and I'm not denigrating buyers, although it might sound this way, is that most buyers will say, this is our position. And that's absolutely fine. And it's a decision by the sellers whether or not to accept that position. And it goes back to that first question. Is this normal? Is this reasonable? What am I doing here? So it's the legals, it's the documents, but it's also the answers that put sellers' mind at ease to say, am I entering into this, to coin a phrase, on a market standard basis? Now, you asked me a question about legal representation. The answer is, it goes back to a question I'm always asked and on many webinars is timing, Guvvy. You know, how long do these things take? Well, it boils down to who is the advisory team. So if your buyer says, oh, corporate lawyers are generally very expensive, I will use the solicitor that helped me buy my house. Okay, then you've got a different nuance in terms of timing, because quite frankly, if most people don't know what they're doing, the answer is no, I don't accept it. You know, the shutters come down.
Yeah,
and then
this
of course,
is a specialist area of law, isn't it? Some people aren't aware of that.
absolutely right. Very specialist when it comes to selling a company. And again, a number of reasons why. First is experience. You know, Maung and I have been doing this for a number of years. So it's not only seeing the documents and understanding them, it's seeing the documents and translating them for sellers. You know, a share purchase agreement, an acquisition agreement, an SPA. I've already given you 3 descriptions of the same document and the same thing. Okay. Now, our job is to translate it and say, it means this. You know, a seller will see the SPA and it will run between 70 and 115 pages, and they'll see it and they'll say, Guvvy, Maung, what on earth does this mean? And our job is, it means this. It's not important, ignore it. Or it's important, and this is how it affects the pound to go into your pocket.
So that touches on something Maung referred to a moment ago as well. Part of what you're getting, I guess, by appointing a specialist lawyer that knows what they're doing is that reassurance when stuff comes up, because it surely does. And I know, Maung, you acted for me a few years ago on a buyout, and I'd never done a management buyout before. Although I've been in business for 35 years, I'd never done a buyout of a business that I had a stakeholding in. And having you on the end of the phone, being able to translate, you mentioned it, Guvvy, being able to put it in layman's terms, but also give the reassurance whether something was normal or not. Yes. And if it wasn't normal, what is the response or solution? That's part of what you're getting by instructing someone like yourselves.
Yeah, you know, and it goes back exactly to what Guvvy said, you know, market standards, what's normal. The other point to make is that even if as a business owner you were minded to try and do it yourself, there's a very important reason why it's probably not a good idea. And that is because you are very emotionally attached to your business. You know, most business owners at the time they sell, they've built the business up over a number of years. They love what they do. And this is probably, the sale is probably a culmination of years and years worth of, you know, blood, sweat and tears into their business. It's an emotional moment, emotional period for them selling. And we can take that emotion out of it. So when issues come up between buyers and sellers that could be quite contentious, we can diffuse any tension. We can speak to the business owner and say, listen, I understand it's emotional for you, but this is something either you don't have to worry about, or yes, this is concerning and this is how we can find a way through. So we act almost as a middleman to take the emotion out of it, to make sure that the transaction goes smoother.
Yeah, if you've appointed the right lawyer in the first place.
That's correct.
Because I mean, you can't say this, but I can. That the definition of a good lawyer, in my humble opinion, is one that's pragmatic, knows the law and is pragmatic and wants to get the deal over the line. But there are a few lawyers out there that would rather score points against the other legal team, and sometimes that can kill a deal. And you do need that sort of air of pragmatism. So just to drill down on specific, Guvvy, this comes up quite often, which is the subject of heads of terms. There is a common misunderstanding about heads of term versus the sale purchase agreement. So it'd be helpful to the audience, just in straightforward terms, to explain the difference. And also the second part is how much should go in a heads of terms and how much should go into the sale purchase agreement.
Well, Rob, how long have you got?
About 30 seconds. Go for it.
I've sent somebody a bill, Rob, so it's got to be more than 30 seconds. So let's just break this down. Heads of terms are, frankly, the outline of what we have had a handshake on. Okay. Do we need to have them? If you're a seller, no, you don't really need heads of terms, because quite frankly, you could do a handshake, you could exchange emails, okay, and say, this is what we've agreed. Can we now put this into motion with the lawyers, assuming the lawyers haven't been involved at the start? Okay, and I'm going to talk about in motion in a second, because that relates to share purchase agreement. Your buyer will expect, and again, it's a number of descriptions, a letter of intent, a memorandum of understanding, an offer letter, heads of terms. And it goes back to your original point, Rob, that do you need a corporate lawyer? Yes, you do, because I've just given you 4 descriptions of the same document that are set out to do the same thing. Now, why will your buyer want heads of terms? Because they will want exclusivity. Okay, that is the key bit from heads of terms. And when your buyer says, Rob, we love your business, we've agreed pounds X, please, for a period of 2, 3, whatever it might be, months, please don't speak with anybody else, because we're expending time and money looking into your company. Okay, so the difference is, quite frankly, the heads of terms are the outline. We have a handshake on this basis. We don't want you talking to anybody else, dear seller, because we're spending time and money. Okay, and a nuance below that, of course, is, well, how do you, and I'm probably giving away a secret here, how do you handle, dear seller, the situation where your buyer says, we're offering you £5 million for your company, and you're already thinking about buying the yacht or the Lamborghini, and halfway through, your buyer says, very sorry, deliberate or not, innocent or not, but your buyer says, we're actually going to offer you £2 million. What happens in that situation? How do you handle exclusivity? And I'm not going to say any more than that. Okay. Now, the difference between that and a share purchase agreement is, the share purchase agreement is the key document. And I talked a second ago, the number of pages that it might run to, that sets out and triggers the sale of the shares. So if we take a step back, the heads of terms don't sell your company. The heads of terms say, we've agreed a deal on this basis. This is the process. This is the timing. Please, dear seller or sellers, can we have exclusivity? Okay. Yeah. How much time should you spend? A great question, Rob. If you are spending an inordinate amount of time on your heads of terms, you've agreed a deal in principle on Monday, and 6 weeks later, you are still trying to agree the heads of terms, we have a problem. And how do you solve that problem? Well, you either say, everybody will just move straight to share purchase agreement, because the challenge is, if your heads of terms are going into 9, 10, 11, 12 pages, you've pretty much started drafting a share purchase agreement.
Yeah, you're right. And it's interesting what you mentioned about buyers requiring it for exclusivity. I'll come to Maung in a sec, Maung, for anything added on to what Guvvy has said. But there are buyers out there that want to buy businesses very cheaply, certainly with not very much money up front. And one of the tactics that's used is to get someone, a buyer to get a seller not to instruct lawyers, do it in a hotel room when we could meet in hotel rooms.
Yeah.
but get them to sign heads of terms, because they're getting exclusivity, the buyer. And they have the intention that there's no way they'll make some sort of fanciful offer that looks and feels attractive, but they have no intention of completing the deal on those terms. But what they have done is got the the seller to commit without legal representation, signing heads of terms, and now it could be 3 months, 4 months, 6 months sometimes, I've heard. And that's, of course, plenty of time for the buyer to chip on price and diminish the terms. So it's a tactic I know that's out there. So yeah, I mean, Maung, would you add anything to what Guvvy has summarised there?
No, I mean, Guvvy's absolutely right in what he says. I think probably the only couple of bits to add is that the value we can add to heads of terms for sellers, sort of two main ways. One is incorporating in the heads of terms confidentiality clause, because after the heads of terms, as Guvvy says, you'll move on to the transaction proper. You'll be looking at the SPA being drafted by the buyer solicitors. You'll be looking at the process of due diligence starting. There'll be a lot of information and data being sent to the buyer, maybe being made available in the data room. You want to make sure that the buyer doesn't get any potential confidential information and then sort of says, really sorry, don't really want to proceed. He's got customer lists, client lists, any valuable intellectual property. So that's the first point. The second point is also, again, it may sound logical, but include restrictions on a buyer speaking to and possibly soliciting employees. If you have very important people that work in your organization, as a seller, one thing we always advise is not to give the buyer access to those employees too early in the process, firstly, but also protect yourself, protect your business by having these non-solicitation restrictions in the heads of terms. And that way you know that the buyer isn't going to walk away with any of your important stuff.
Do you know what? That's a really good point, Maung, because if you didn't do that and you got caught out by a disreputable buyer, they don't need to buy your business, do they? Because they'll have your staff, your key staff.
They'll have your
anyway.
staff.
Why
they'll
would
have
you
your business information, your client lists. So yeah, I mean that's probably the important thing about the heads.
Yeah, there is the Latin. I have used this a while back. Most people know caveat emptor, buyer beware. But cave emptoris is beware of the buyer, which is the reverse.
I like that one.
It's like anything in life. There's two sides to it, to every perspective. Okay, so how long should the whole, Guvvy, this question's for you, how long should the due diligence process take typically? What's your experience?
Again, a great question, Rob. Now it's influenced by the scope of the request. It's influenced by the advisory team's scope. So if you have, 15 people on the buy side asking questions, and that ignores a crossover, because sometimes there's lots of crossover. Mm-hmm. And this is the key bit for sellers to remember, is that you haven't sold your company until the money's in the bank. So you must focus on running the business because it hasn't been sold. So as a seller, what can you do to mitigate against running your business and focusing on due diligence? Well, first question is, do you have management team that can help you with it? Okay. Or is it confidential, as we talked about a second ago, that you can't bring in the management team to help you? Okay. So that will slow down timing, because quite frankly, you'll have evenings and weekends and maybe a couple of hours every day to do it.
Yeah.
Can you allocate your accountant or your lawyers to help you? So it's a great question, but it's very much influenced on advisory teams, seller nuancing. So many different factors are involved, Rob, that you can't really put a finger on it and go, it's generally this.
I really like you, Guvvy, but I'm not going to let you get away with that. Give me a range without being too specific. What is it? I mean, particularly currently, sort of post-COVID lockdowns from last year. How long is it taking, this DD process?
Well, let's give you some practical examples. I'm handling a number of deals now, and if I picked 2 or 3 of them, it's taking, on one transaction, we've done due diligence in 3 weeks. On another one, we are 7 weeks in, and we're just about finalizing it. On another transaction, we haven't made any progress because the seller's enjoying the upswing in their business. And of course, that then begs the question, where is the attention? And then that then begs the question, where is this going in terms of deal pricing? So I still didn't answer your question, Rob.
I'll try Maung. at least I gave it a second go, Guvvy.
I mean, from my perspective, Rob, I've done transactions where the due diligence has run into completion week, where there's still requests. So let's say in a 2-month or 3-month transaction, it's been a continuous process, particularly I think where private equity are involved, because they will engage separate advisors in relation to commercial due diligence. There'll be obviously the financial, the tax. There might be due diligence around IT systems, where they'll have a particular IT specialist looking at that. There'll be customer referencing, which is another point that they always want to, private equity generally wants it to do. More often than not, it's towards the end of the transaction, towards the end. But yeah, I mean, like Guvvy says, it depends greatly. We've done some really quick DD processes where it's, you know, a month and a half, and some where during the course of a 3-month transaction, it's been ongoing through that time.
Yeah, yeah. And from my experience, the last 20 years of selling businesses, it's tending to take longer, I would say, over those 2 decades, because some of the reasons you've just mentioned, Mal. But I would normally quote a client in the past 3 to 6 months, typically. Could be longer, could be shorter. I mean, a bit like Guvvy's done, really. Give it all the codicils. But it's true. But it's right, is it? Because you don't know what you're going to find when you lift up the drain cover as a buyer. You don't know what's lying there, waiting to be found, or maybe disguised, or a misunderstanding, or something, missing information. Because as business owners, we're all busy growing businesses, and perhaps we don't do things in the way that we should. And it only comes to light when we come to sell our business, and there's gaps. You know, even if it's no shareholders agreement, there's a common one, because it's all been done on a handshake and gentleman's agreement.
That's very true, Rob.
I know, because I've referred people to you guys that got no shareholders agreement, and they want to sell their business.
But that's interesting, because that point that you've just brought up, it's a very important point, and it kind of feeds into the question about the length of time it takes to do due diligence, because as Guvvy said, it depends on the parties. Now, as a seller, another way to mitigate that process is to make sure that pre-sale you have everything in place that you need to have. And so you know that you're going to be asked a certain set of questions by a buyer. And this is what we frequently do. I know all 3 of us do in terms of prepping companies for sale, and in terms of taking them through the sort of initial checklists of things that they will need available or in place during the DD process. Having those key pieces of information to hand makes the process much simpler, because some of the delays are simply down to the seller saying, well, I know it's somewhere, it's either at my home or the office, or I'll need to check and get back to you, particularly with COVID, when you can't travel, you can't locate information. Yeah, I mean, that can be a key factor.
In the early days of being an owner manager, I used to keep the backup to my CRM system in the back of my Mercedes. Well, at least it was lockable.
That's true.
Haven't you been driving Porsche for years?
Well, someone's Mercedes, I kept the backup. But we did a piece of work together recently, Maung, and the conclusion of that was that I received something called the Bible. The documents. That is huge. It's so huge, it's difficult to send it electronically, isn't it? I mean, I think as business owners, we underestimate the amount of paperwork that's virtual paperwork that's needed. And it's not until you see it in one big lump as a file you realize how involved and complex selling a business is. Even if it's a relatively small business, doesn't have to be large to be complex.
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, any other tips? Perhaps, Guvvy, direct this one to you. Maung's sort of suggested that prep phase. Any other practical tips you could share that would just help that process of selling the business, particularly when you enter DD, due diligence, that would just help it go that little bit smoother? Shorter.
So again, it boils down to the advisory team. Stay close with us. You know, you will, as I said before, most people aren't repeat offenders. So you sell your company once and stay close with us, because you've got a business to run. So the practical tip is and I'll give you some context, is what I suggested on some transactions to sellers is, look, you're being asked all these questions. You're being asked to allocate all these documents. please don't do that. Just put them all together. Just, to use a colloquialism, just dump them into the data room and we'll handle it for you. We'll allocate it to the question. We will review it. Let us act as a buffer to make the process more efficient for you. Because as business owners, we are probably susceptible to a lot of control. It's my business. This is how I've done things. This is how I get my solutions. This is how I deliver on my business. And sometimes that flows through to due diligence. I'm handling it. I'm dealing with it. You don't need to. You've got us to help you. So please give it to us. We'll process it. We'll review it. And we'll work out how to upload it to data rooms. So, and as part of that, communicate to us to say, Guvvy, Maung, what does this question mean? Because a lot of the time, due diligence questionnaires are, rightly or wrongly, pro forma. Okay, so it might, to again more context, if you're selling a consultancy company, and I always use this example, if you're selling a consultancy company, okay, do you really need to ask 10, 11 questions about the stock? Because quite frankly, how much stock is going to be on the balance sheet on a consultancy company? You flip that around, you're selling an engineering business, then okay, stock's important, plant and machinery is important. So if you are, dear seller, if you are reviewing a due diligence questionnaire and you're thinking, can I really put non-applicable to this? Of course you can. Because sometimes it will be not applicable, but communicate with us and we'll take you through it.
Yeah, you mentioned data rooms there, Guvvy, and since I exited my own business, I've been looking to buy businesses, and industry agnostic at the moment, really.
Okay.
But tends to be stressed or distressed businesses. The way I look at it is they're undervalued. Something's gone wrong or something's not working that's affecting the performance of the business. And I've probably had 40 plus sales prospectuses I've seen, all from insolvency practitioners.
Okay.
And they have a data room. I have to say, it's no data rooms that I would recognize from these insolvency practitioners. Don't expect you guys to comment, obviously, because you work for a very reputable legal firm, but it's sparse. There's always gaps of significant material information that I have to go chasing for as the potential buyer. And I almost get the impression that they don't want to sell the business because the sales prospectus is lacking. The backup information is patchy at best. It's almost as though they're going through the motions. And you must see this perhaps in your own context with buyers and sellers. That you look in the data room. Perhaps if you're on the buy side, working on representing on the legal side of the buy side, there's gaps.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I can just talk about two perspectives, buyer and seller perspective, incredibly important from a buying perspective to speak to for us to speak to our client, and for us to say, look, taking Guvvy's examples, which are very good ones. You're buying a consultancy company, so I'm not going to ask about stock as opposed to sending a generic template, because that narrows the scope of my questions to what's really important. Is the contract for the coffee machine in the hall really important to whether or not you buy the business? It may be if you really like coffee, but in most circumstances, it's not. Focus on have the due diligence questionnaire tailored, and lots of I guess advisors and buyers not necessarily take that approach, but that has impact in two main places: cost, because obviously there's going to be a lot more back and forth, and timing. It's going to take longer. From the sales side, as Guvvy said, work with us. We will work to filter out any unnecessary questions, and we will make sure that any answers we get are relevant to the point and answer the questions. That's what we will do for our selling clients to make sure that process goes as smooth and as quickly as possible.
Because I know as a buyer, the first immediate thought, if there's big material gaps in the data room, what are they hiding is my immediate thought. And that gets me suspicious, which means I start digging more for stuff, and I then become suspicious. So by the time that I'm on a Zoom call with the potential seller, I'm already on a negative angle as a buyer. I might still want to buy the business, but I'm going to give them a harder time, all because they didn't get the proper advice or didn't take any advice about how to populate that data room, which is basically a library, isn't it? A virtual library.
That's it. It's an electronic library in the cloud with lots of different folders that can hold vast quantities of information. And that's where we are at the moment. I mean, back in sort of Guvvy's time as a young lawyer, they used to have physical data rooms.
Wasn't it?
But, used to meet on completion day in person.
Yeah, look, I remember in terms of artificial intelligence and helping us. I remember physical data rooms where you used to go in and you used to have to photocopy stuff and sort of sign in sign out copies you've taken. You mentioned physical completion meetings now. Technology has enabled us to complete remotely, sign things electronically. So we're taking vast leaps, but going back to timing, there is of course a cost to these technological advances, but they all make the process or supposed to make the process quicker and easier for all parties.
Next question for Guvvy, really, and it's building on what we've just discussed. You've mentioned a number of pitfalls to avoid in terms of getting the information, making sure there aren't gaps. So get the information together, which is the positive. Any other common pitfalls that you guys have come across? Start with Guvvy first, that just slow the process down, or even worse, can scupper a deal.
Great question, Rob. I think I'm going to just connect to what you said a second ago about buying businesses. We are all humans when we're coming to buying and sell companies, and got to mitigate that cognitive bias. That's the key. When I negotiate, and again, it underpins this whole discussion, is that we are, I'm afraid, susceptible to cognitive biases. You talked about gaps in a data room. Okay. There might be nothing insidious about it. It might be, I'm busy, dear Rob, trying to salvage what's left of my business so I get the most value. And quite frankly, putting things into an electronic library isn't a priority for me. I'm sorry. I'm on the phone to my customers and my suppliers trying to get the best value. But you've come from the angle of, well, what's missing? What else is missing? I'm not sure I trust this process anymore. And now you've gone into the area of, what neuroscience is called, commitment and consistency. You've told yourself, I don't trust this process. What else is missing? So it's a cognitive bias we have to defend against. You asked me about pitfalls. That's one of them, because and I'm probably digressing slightly, but if you go into negotiations with that cognitive bias, it's hard to overcome that. Some more context. If you don't have, corporate lawyers of repute acting for you, then the cognitive bias influence is worse. Because if you've got conveyancers on both sides, I'm not denigrating conveyances, any other discipline than corporate, then a pitfall is, well, this is unreasonable. This is unreasonable. I haven't seen this before. And it might not be. It might be. We all corporate lawyers, despise the phrase indemnity. Well, hang on a second. It might be reasonable for your buyer to ask for an indemnity because the risk is fair. And one of the answers is, I adopt in negotiations is, if I was acting on the buy side, would I ask for this? If I ask for it, why am I asking for it? And, it isn't really fair for any lawyers to say, oh, this is an indemnity, we shouldn't accept it. Okay, well, right. So pitfall is, quite frankly, cognitive biases in negotiations, and we have to keep an open-minded approach for both sides. This isn't litigation. You've seen my social media posts, Rob. I always talk about not being a litigator, because you have a willing buyer, willing seller. We want to sell, you want to buy. How do we do that in the most efficient way where everybody is not left reeling from the experience?
No, I like what you say. I mean, is there anything you would add in terms of common pitfalls, Maung, from your experience?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of my takeaways over the last few years is that it's really important for sellers to pay attention to their contracts, the contracts that they have in place for the business.
Right.
And that's important because when it comes to the sale process, the buyer is going to scrutinize those contracts. Now, I'll give you a practical example of a transaction that I've worked on where this came under close scrutiny. And this is particularly relevant where a buyer is basing the purchase price on revenue of some kind, whether it's recurring revenue under a contract. It's also particularly relevant where you have a large proportion of turnover in a very small number of contracts. It's even more important. So in a particular transaction we were dealing with, the company, the sellers had probably 80 to 85% of their turnover on which the buyer based its purchase price on a very small number of high value contracts. Now, there's nothing wrong with that in theory, apart from the fact in this case, they thought they had negotiated sort of fixed term contracts. When we looked and the buyer scrutinized the contracts, it transpired that either side could give 6 months notice to terminate those contracts, which obviously gave the buyer no security to that revenue was going to continue. Speaking to the clients, very innocent mistake. They believed that, you know, when these large corporations offered them the contract, as business owners, you're worried about getting the money in, getting the income in, generating cash from the business. You don't automatically think, actually, I can negotiate these contracts. There may be some terms in those contracts that don't suit me, don't suit my business, and won't be beneficial for me in the long run. And so it's important as one of the sort of pre-sale things that all business owners need to do: scrutinize the contracts you have with customers, with suppliers, and these contracts can be negotiated. So don't be afraid to speak to your friendly lawyer and say, is this okay for me to sign? We've agreed that these contracts are going to be for a fixed term of 10 years. Does it do that or not?
Right. So I'm just picking up something from what both of you have said, actually, a golden thread really is, as part of your thought process about an exit, is why not get you guys involved early doors? To have an initial review, because every business is different. And presumably that's a service that you offer. If someone's looking to sell, maybe to do a review.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think Guvvy and I both, pre-sale, we will take them through a mock due diligence process. We'll give them a tailored questionnaire. We'll say this is kind of the information that you need to gather that needs to be made available. And we both do sort of general business reviews to make sure that they have key contractual documentation in place, employment contracts, they're compliant with data protection legislation and so on. So very, very sensible to do that.
And they're not keeping the backup of their CRM in their second-hand Mercedes.
That's right.
Second-hand now, Rob. You know, second-hand a while ago.
But I know what it's like with business owners. You are, particularly if you're the founder and it's a startup and you're scaling up, it's all about cash generation to grow the business. So often as business owners, we can't see the wood for the trees, and we're not paying attention to those things that might bite us in the bottom later on. So I think that's a brilliant thing, is to go through that due diligence questionnaire as part of a piece of work that you do for a client. Well, it's going to help you guys as well, isn't it, when you're instructed for the sale?
Absolutely right, Rob. And the other thing, of course, is it's the exit, it's a pre-exit, it's the exit and the post-exit, because as you've transitioned from business owner to somebody who has a level of wealth. So, we can help you work out, I won't dwell too much on it, but, are your wills still appropriate? You've now come into substantial wealth. Should we now need to look at your wills, or do we need to look at your wills now? Because business owners, you've been running at 120 miles an hour, growing the business. It's now ripe for sale. But have you looked after your personal matters? Do you need some trusts to be set up? Your wills. So we can handle all of it, but it has to be looked at early.
For some of us, it'd be a prenup. I'm getting married next year.
Are you?
Yeah,
Are you,
yeah.
are you inviting your lawyers?
Absolutely. You're my two best men.
You're
Nothing
inviting-
like having a lawyer present at a
conversation
legal
might be
ceremony.
privileged. I can tell you that now.
It'll be overseas. I don't know whether there'll be much of a struggle for you both.
Well,
No, I mean, on a serious note, you're right, and because you work for a law firm that's a full service law firm, and these other ancillary, I call them, perhaps the wrong word, but these other areas are really important because your life has changed once you've sold, and and part of it is wealth, but also it's about life after sale as well, and making sure that the money you've generated will last your lifetime.
Absolutely.
In a tax efficient way. And it is the things about the wills, estate planning, because God forbid, the biggest cost of selling a business is tax. And in fact, the biggest cost to life is tax. They even tax you after you're dead or your estate anyway.
Yes.
I mean, it's I won't go down that route, but yeah, I think that's a very good point that you make. It is about those other areas to make sure that you have that security and peace of mind.
Absolutely right. Absolutely.
So
right.
Just one final question, really, because you've been very generous with your time. One golden tip from each of you. Can't be the same one, by the way, Guvvy. Don't just say ditto. I'm sure you won't. One golden tip. If someone is watching this and is thinking about exiting, some pearl of wisdom that you would give to help them on that journey so that it becomes a successful transaction eventually rather than a casualty of something going wrong. Guvvy, Maung, actually.
So I think, and you had a name for this, Rob, I can't remember the name for it, but it's having a plan and being prepared. So I think when you start a business, it's having that plan of where you want to be and how you want to get there, right?
Yep.
So if you have that very clear in your mind, the exit strategy becomes much easier. And then if you plan for that, and by planning, I mean speak to your professional advisors, speak about what you want to achieve, your goals and how you want to get there. They can then put the necessary documents, plans in place for you from either a legal perspective, financial perspective, or whatever it may be, so that you can work towards your exit. And when you get to the transactional stage, you will have everything in place. It will make everything much smoother.
Brilliant. I think I refer to it commonly as start with the end in mind.
Yeah, that's it.
And as someone we both know and love, he said, plan for divorce. Guvvy, what's your pearl of wisdom for the audience out there to make sure there isn't a bump in the road that causes them to go off course?
Communication.
Right. Okay.
Because, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of being in the sale process, because Maung has, quite rightly and wonderfully explained the pre leading up to exit. But if you look at it from I'm in the sale process, communicate, because, and I do, I'm repeating it. So, and I'm very sorry, but most sellers aren't repeat offenders, and there'll be so many questions that arise that you want to have them answered quickly. So please speak to your professional advisors, your corporate lawyers, and say, Guvvy, rather than agonizing over seeing a 75-page document, and the first question is one of the questions will be, am I doing the right thing by signing this? Okay.
Right.
The second question is, and this is, I've been 15 years, I've been helping clients buy and sell companies. And one of the questions is always, is this normal?
Yeah.
Is this normal? Okay.
I've done that.
And that question will arise every single time. And I talk a lot about cognitive biases, neuroscience, because that feeds into the psychology of negotiations. But if that question is not answered quickly and satisfactorily, most sellers will say, I don't think I'm doing the right thing. Am I doing the right thing? Is this normal? And the proverbial molehill becomes the mountain. So communicate, call Maung, call me and say, is this normal? And we will translate, we will support, we will guide.
I know one of the things you do as someone that's benefited from that with my clients and from myself, you often have weekly reviews, particularly as you get closer to the finishing line. That is essential. It is because of the communication that you mentioned, Guvvy. Otherwise, people assume things, and where there's a lack of information, imagination can take over, and misunderstanding. So, absolutely right. Two brilliant golden tips there. What's the easiest way for someone to get in touch with you, chaps?
You can email us, call us. Both of us are very accessible. So, we've got our website there with all our contact details of all the team there. So, there are no barriers to contacting us whatsoever. We're both on social media. So it's very easy to get in touch with us should anyone want to.
Yeah. And even if it might be that you might be wanting to sell in 5 years' time, but you've got to get your ducks in a row. Pick up the phone or DM one of the guys on LinkedIn, or just give them a call to sound them out. It may be that they would put you in touch with one of their colleagues within the law firm to get some of these things in place, but also have a discussion about planning for the exit. As opposed to you guys being dropped in it at heads of term stage and then you've got to wade through. So I highly recommend these two guys. I've worked with them for many, many years, used them personally, and also referred several dozen clients to them. And I would say, for anyone that's listening, that's thinking about selling, but not sure what to do, but wants their business valued, get in touch with me. I've spent 20 years giving an indication as to what business may or may not be worth. And as the two chaps, I'm sure, will nod to, I'm quite direct and honest about what their business probably isn't worth. So if you want to get an idea as to what your business might be worth on the open market, give me a call as well, or DM me on LinkedIn. Guys, you're very generous with your time. Really appreciate it. And catch up with you soon.
Thanks, Rob. Bill's in the post.